Thank you for listening to Tales from Wytch Haven. This podcast is created by Dan Lee and Rodeo Whiter and produced by Rodeax. Hello, thanks for tuning in. I'm Jackson Thorne, reporting to you from JT Auto Repairs for all your motoring needs. As always, I'm joined by co-host and published author Imelda Blackwood.
Thank you, Jackson. If you're a regular listener, welcome back. If this is the first time you've tuned in, congratulations, you've made it. On this public access radio show, we aim to uncover all of the mysteries of our unassuming little town and expose them for what they are. A dark conspiracy? A supernatural threat from the great beyond? Or just a big misunderstanding?
This week in Wytch Haven, we have had the pleasure of playing host to Small Town Antiquities, a pop-up antique shop that's been visiting us for some time now.
Every now and again, always when the shop has just escaped our memory, it will return, plain as night, as if it has always been there.
It's funny how it does that. It will be there for months, then suddenly it disappears overnight, and a year, maybe 2 years later, when we've all moved on and stopped thinking about it, it'll just turn up again, always looking the same. Same cobweb, same old awning, same blackboard standing outside, detailing what curiosities the shop has to offer.
I'm sure all of you, dear listeners, will be familiar with the store's proprietor, Mr. Heston Sklar, who disappears with his shop overnight, only to return years later, never aging a day, and never acknowledging that any time has elapsed at all between his visits to Wytch Haven.
I've always wondered where he goes when he's not there, whether he sets up shop in other towns or what.
Perhaps Mr. Sklar spends his time travelling the globe in search of true curiosities. But Mary from the sweet shop told me he simply waits until we've forgotten him and then returns.
He does always seem to have very exotic items on sale. Very rare, too.
I once purchased a snowdrop that never wilts or dies. Even in the heady warmth of summer, it blooms with the most unassuming beauty.
Is that the flower you have stood in the teapot in the kitchen?
That's right, the one on the windowsill.
How curious. Well, he's been back again this week with some very interesting artefacts.
Indeed, perhaps some of them are a little too interesting.
At first, we just thought it was the usual Wytch Haven superstition. As soon as something bad happens, everyone jumps to the conclusion that it's a curse or a spell or something. On Monday, Marjorie Wainwright veered off the road and crashed her car into the old oak tree. When the authorities asked her what had happened, she said something about the little boy in the back seat startling her. However, there were no passengers. Only a garden gnome she had bought from Small Town Antiquities that very afternoon.
Mr. Horace of the Vegetable Committee told me that he'd bought an antique shovel from Heston Sklar, only to find that his potatoes had all contracted blight.
And do you remember Mrs. Weeder's narcoleptic incident?
Oh yes. At first we chalked that up to her pricking her finger on a rather suspect rose, but now I'm not so sure. She did, after all, purchase a pair of never-blunting, never-rusting secateurs from the shop earlier that day.
After a couple of days, Imelda and I decided to investigate the shop. By this point, people were starting to point fingers at Mr. Sklar, so we thought we could put an end to the wild accusations, if nothing else.
As it happened, we put a stop to more than just accusations.
That's right. We went to go and speak to Mr. Sklar, a familiar face to all of us. However, he was acting rather odd. He wasn't his usual self at all.
No, he wasn't. The daylight was beginning to wane by the time we paid Small Town Antiquities a visit. Our shadows were long, and most of the townsfolk had retired to their homes, shying away from the lazy stillness of the evening. Everything about the shop seemed in order, until we opened the door. As usual, the windows were adorned with ancient cobwebs, as if the shop had always been there. And peering inside, we could see objets d'art and curiosities beyond imagination, each neatly tagged like artefacts in a museum.
Everything was as it always had been.
I pushed the door open, and as usual I heard the hinges creak and the distant far-away chime of the bell. The air was dense and musty, thick with the heady aromas of far-off lands and unknown antiquities. Incense burned somewhere in the shop, puffing out plumes of smoke that drifted silently on the air. Yes, everything was as it always had been, but at the same time it wasn't. Somehow something was wrong, as if a deep decay was rising from beneath the floor, filling the room with its poison.
Imagine knowing that a corpse was rotting in the walls, but its stench hadn't filtered through the room yet. That's how it felt in Small Town Antiquities.
Then, as we moved soberly through the shop, the man himself emerged from the furniture. Heston Sklar, as always, appeared behind us after we had entered. We had come to expect it. In fact, usually when one visits small-town Antiquities, it is custom to take a few steps into the shop to allow Mr. Sklar to make his appearance.
But he wasn't charming like he usually is. He didn't draw us in, or make any of his usual sales spiel.
No, his eyes kept darting around the room, as if he was nervous that someone might be watching him. And he couldn't stand still. His usual enigmatic manner was lost entirely.
Needless to say, we certainly didn't buy anything from the shop. I thought about asking him directly if there might be something dangerous afoot, but I decided that he probably wouldn't tell us even if there was. So instead, I asked for a copy of his sales book, so that we could see exactly who had bought what from small-town Antiquities.
Quite ingeniously, Jackson told Sklar that we were hoping to do a segment all about the shop on this very show. He told Sklar that we wanted to see the sales book so as to compile some statistics on the shop's success and popularity.
When I mentioned the radio show, Heston Sklar suddenly stopped shuffling around. He looked me in the eyes, and I could see that he was excited. He obviously liked this idea. And something told me it wasn't just his usual thirst for sales.
We took photographs of the book. However, we knew that if anyone bought anything in the meantime, we would have no way of finding out and stopping incidents from befalling them.
Of course, by this point, most of the town was so paranoid of getting cursed that the shop probably wasn't getting too much custom anyway.
Indeed. The last person to purchase something at small-town Antiquities was Arthur Mcgregor, and that was the previous morning. So we decided to start with him.
Sitting in Arthur's living room over a cup of tea, he told us in great detail exactly what he had bought. It was a leather-bound copy of one of his favourite books, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
I always think leather-bound books are the best smelling of all bound literature.
It was quite a nice copy, wasn't it?
Indeed.
Arthur had bought the book yesterday morning and intended to bring it to the next Friends of the Library meeting. However, every time he picked it up, without fail, he had gotten a paper cut.
There wasn't a finger on either of poor Arthur's hands that wasn't adorned by a plaster.
After we left Arthur's, Imelda and I discussed it, trying to figure out what could possibly make a book treat its reader in that way. Of course, witchcraft is always a possibility in this town, so we decided that we would have to speak to a member of the local coven, the Sisters of the Blood Moon. But first we thought we would visit everyone on the list.
We went from house to house, listening to the townsfolk's accounts, each story more grisly than the last.
There were 19 people in total who had bought items from small-town Antiquities, and of those people no one had had a good experience. Every single item that had been bought at that antique shop seemed to be punishing its owner for buying it. The shop had only been open for 3 days, and it had already caused a car crash, several injuries, night terrors, haunting visions, and uncontrollable levitation in one case.
Except we hadn't heard from everyone who bought something, had we?
No, we had not.
I suspect that many of our younger listeners will be quite familiar with Charity Proctor, a charming young girl in her 4th year at Wytch Haven High. Charity is daughter to our local reverend. She had bought something from the musty little shop on the afternoon of its first day of trading. According to the sales book, it was a religious artifact. However, unlike the other items listed in the book, this one had a rather mysterious symbol inked onto the page beside its name. It looked to be a straight vertical line with 5 diagonal slashes stacked down its length. This was set in the centre of a circle, and on either side a crescent shape jutted out from the ring.
We passed by the vicarage to pay Charity a visit, but instead we were met by Reverend Proctor. He was quite taken aback when we asked to speak to his daughter, but he invited us in to find out what it was about.
That's when he told us that 2 days ago, when Charity had returned from school having visited the shop on her way home, she had not been herself at all. She had entered silently, and instead of taking up the usual chatter with her father, she had drifted straight to her bedroom and remained there all night, and the following day as well.
Apparently the Reverend had opted not to investigate as Charity is 14 years old, and therefore prone to what he calls scary teenage girls syndrome.
That's right. Instead, our good Reverend had simply avoided her bedroom at all costs in a bid to wait for it to blow over.
But it didn't blow over, because after spending an entire day in her room, Charity had risen in the night and simply left.
Of course, Reverend Proctor always has a Horlicks before bed, which apparently makes him a very heavy sleeper. It was only the following morning that he realised that his daughter was missing, and at that point he assumed that she had left early for school. In fact, he was delighted that she'd left her room at all.
Then, when evening came and she didn't return from school, that's when Reverend Proctor really started to worry.
So at this point, she had been missing for just over a day. Obviously the Reverend had called at Charity's friends' houses and visited her usual haunts, but to no avail. The child was nowhere to be found.
The missing girl, coupled with the strange symbol and all of the unusual incidents, certainly spelled trouble. So we took it upon ourselves to dig a little deeper into the antique shop, after hours.
When night had swaddled us in her blanket of stars and Mother Moon had risen, Jackson and I slunk like shadows toward small-town Antiquities. The blackboard kept watch outside, standing quietly beside the shop like a sleeping sentinel, and the awning flapped and flitted in the cool night breeze like the wings of a great bat stretching into the sky, preparing to take flight.
Usually in our nighttime investigations, a pair of bolt cutters would do it, but tonight was more of a challenge. It took me several attempts before I was able to pick the lock and slowly push the door open. As always, the hinges let out a groan, but I stopped the door from opening enough to hit the bell, just in case.
We slipped inside, and once again we were hit with that musty smell of age and incense, and like our previous visit, a sense of unease crept into each of us. Something unnatural was afoot in this shop.
We crept between the display cases in the dark, trying to be as silent as possible in case Mr. Sklar might be lurking in the back room. There was no light coming from beneath the door, but you really can't be too sure in these situations.
We must have spent at least half an hour peering into all of the display cases to try and spot anything unusual. But when confronting a shop that exclusively sells curiosities, it's hard to determine what is unusual and what isn't.
Eventually we found it, though.
Yes. When we reached the counter and slipped behind it to see what dark secrets Heston Sklar might be hiding, we happened upon something all too familiar. That same symbol that was etched into the book, carved into the very floor beneath our feet. This time the symbol was at least 1 metre wide, carved into the exact spot that Mr. Sklar might stand when serving a customer. Jackson and I looked at each other, each sharing a common thought. This couldn't be a coincidence.
We immediately bent down to investigate and quickly realised that it wasn't just etched into the floor. It was carved into a trap door.
It was almost invisible, the way it slotted so neatly amongst the floorboards, and I was surprised to note that there was not a single measure of security. No padlocks, no chains, just a hidden panel, easily lifted once you find the notch in the wood.
We found it, and as Imelda said, it was far too easy to lift the trap door.
Naturally, we both had our head torches, and peering into the gloom below, I suddenly realised where the trapdoor must lead. It's always been common knowledge that buried beneath our unassuming little town are a matrix of tunnels that house the dead. The catacombs of Wytch Haven are no secret.
That's when I remembered that the building that we were stood in used to belong to an undertaker.
Indeed, you can all read about it in our local records. Not 40 years ago, this very shop was an undertaker, and had been for more than 100 years. So it made perfect sense that built into its foundations was an entrance to the catacombs. But still, kneeling beside the gaping pit, stench of the dead rising up to greet us, one couldn't help but feel a shiver of fear.
We had to go down there. If the symbol inked next to Charity's item was anything of consequence, I was willing to bet that we would find our answers down in those tunnels.
And so, not without misgivings, we descended into the tunnels of the dead.
Now, we all know what happened to the trail of breadcrumbs that Hansel and Gretel left, so there was no use in doing that. But we would need to find our way back, and something told me that in the darkness of the tunnels it wouldn't be easy. So instead of leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, I rummaged through the counter until I found an old box of chalk. I knew there would be one somewhere because of the blackboard outside the shop. Once we had made our way down the ladder, I drew an arrow on the floor indicating our exit. I made sure to draw these arrows at regular intervals because I did not want to get lost down there.
The air was dry and laden with dust. Every breath we inhaled felt like a snapping twig, and all was silent as the grave. We were surrounded by death on all sides. Every wall of every tunnel was comprised of shelf upon shelf of human remains, There were coffins and casket, and even the odd sarcophagus. But most of all, there were skulls. Hundreds of them, stuffed into every nook and every cranny.
I even tripped over one that must have fallen from a shelf and rolled into the middle of the tunnel. Then it just sat there staring up at me with its empty eyes.
Goodness knows how many souls reside down there in the darkness. We walked for what felt like hours, no light coming from any direction, all the while Jackson drawing arrows on the floor to mark our path. Several times we were met by forks and crossroads. We knew we couldn't search everywhere. If nothing else, Jackson's waymarkers would grow too confusing. But something in me was driving us forward down one particular path.
I still have no idea how. I may as well have been walking blind, but you seem to know the way.
It wasn't so much a knowledge as an intuition.
Maybe it's a woman thing. My mother always said she had intuition.
Perhaps. In any case, long after we had lost all track of time and direction, we saw a light at the end of the tunnel. It was faint, just a glimmer, but to us it spelled hope. Perhaps our answers lay with the light at the end of these tunnels, and perhaps when we reached it, the mystery would be solved.
We carried on walking, but I swear the light may as well have been moving backwards. It didn't feel like it was getting any closer until it was almost upon us.
There was no sound, nothing alive down here to our knowledge. Yet still, the echoes of our footfalls playing off of the hollow depths of the catacombs drove us near mad. I could almost hear voices in those echoes. The deeper we delved into the darkness, the weaker my grip on reality grew. For all I knew, the world outside could have ended, and all that was left were these tunnels and the restful spirits that lay there. However, we were pilgrims to the light, and as we approached I grew less and less convinced of its nature. New details emerged around it. It seemed to be moving, almost shaking on an axis, and I could see two long shafts jutting out towards the ground, swinging towards us and away again like pendulums. The closer we got, the more that light took the form of some sickening insect coming to swallow us up in the dark where no one would hear us go.
Just hearing you describe it is bringing back all kinds of memories.
As we neared the light, it seemed that the light was nearing us, and as it drew closer, we came to realise that it was not the end of the tunnel. We looked at each other in startling realisation. The light did not mark an escape. The light belonged to Charity Proctor.
Imelda and I stopped in our tracks and stared at her as she was walking towards us. It was like she was in a trance, holding that lantern in front of her and blindly walking her path.
She was still wearing her nightdress. She must have been freezing, and her pale legs jutted out beneath it, swinging like pendulums in and out of the light.
It was as if we were ghosts. She just walked on past us as if we weren't there. And we didn't dare to speak. Something was seriously wrong with her. I drew an X on the ground to indicate that we'd stopped walking this path and turned back. Then we began to follow Charity through the darkness of the catacombs, back the way we came.
It wasn't long before she reached her journey's end. Not long after we started to follow her, she turned a sharp corner down a narrow chasm. Here the stench of death was at its strongest, and we couldn't move from side to side without disturbing the bones in the walls.
As we followed her, I was watching her very closely, and I noticed that in her other hand she was carrying something. It looked like some kind of scroll. I nudged Imelda and pointed at it. She frowned. She didn't know what it was either, but something told me we were running out of time to find out.
That's when the narrow tunnel ended. We had reached a nexus of passageways, and in the centre, lit by Charity's glowing lantern, was the same symbol etched into the floor.
Charity walked straight into the middle of the symbol and stopped dead in her tracks. Imelda and I hung back in the entrance to our narrow tunnel, waiting for something to happen. Then Charity slowly put down her lantern on the floor and took the scroll in both hands.
But it wasn't a scroll, was it?
In her hands, Charity held a roll of ancient fabric. Slowly, still in her trance, she began to unfurl it, and that's when I realised that inside the folds of that fabric was a dagger. She started to speak, chanting in a language that I couldn't understand. It set my teeth on edge.
It was only after this adventure had ended that Jackson told me he couldn't understand her words, for I could comprehend them as easily as my mother tongue. In fact, until Jackson had told me, I thought she was speaking English. She dropped the fabric to the floor, and I could see that inked into its surface were a matrix of runes and symbols, all arranged in an intricate pattern. But the fabric wasn't calling for my concern. Charity had raised the dagger and held it aloft, and in the tone of a sleepwalker she uttered words that I dare not repeat. She had been brought here as a sacrifice. She was the lamb, and she was to be slaughtered for her masters to invoke the elder spirit.
I didn't know what Imelda was doing. She lunged forwards, and before I could catch her, she had grabbed the dagger from Charity's hands and thrown it to the floor. I rushed over and picked it up, along with the fabric it was wrapped in. I wrapped it back up safely and watched as Imelda shook Charity back to consciousness.
She awoke, not knowing where she was, scared, disorientated, and deeply shaken. I thought it best to take her away from this place as quickly as possible.
We retraced our steps with the help of my way markers, and by the time we got back to the shop, it was almost morning.
Our first priority was taking Charity home, so as we walked her to the vicarage, the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon and wash the land with healing light.
Needless to say, I kept a tight grip on the dagger.
Charity was returned home, much to the relief of Reverend Proctor. However, by the time we had returned to the high street, small-town Antiquities was gone. The awning was gone, and as was the blackboard, and the windows were whitewashed, as if no one had been inside for years.
That morning, having not slept all night, we collected our thoughts at the Crooked Kettle.
It seemed that Heston Sklar was to blame for this week's happenings, dabbling in the darkest shades of magic. Who knows what would have happened if the Elder Spirit had have awakened? I am certainly at a loss, but I can, dear listeners, advise caution. Beware if that shop should ever return.
We are coming to the end of this week's broadcast, so that just leaves us with a few community announcements. The garage will be closed this week due to an unwanted howling coming from the air vents. We are advising all children to stay away from the tomatoes at Mrs. Figg's sandwich bar for fear of blisters. And finally, we want to inform you all, the tennis court in the local park has become overrun with pixies, and we would advise that you stay away until this coming Wednesday. We are now approaching the witching hour, so as always, we want to wish you well. Stay safe, dear listeners, and remember, never trust a travelling salesman. Thank you for listening to Tales from Wytch Haven. This podcast was brought to you from the minds of Dan Lee and Rodeo Whiter, produced by Rodeax. If you have enjoyed your stay, please like, subscribe and follow us as we explore more mysteries from this sleepy little town. Beware, the witching hour draws near.